As many of the panelists and speakers have mentioned this morning, for every single carbon removal, carbon management project of the very high significance is the acceptance by the society, by the community that those projects are going to be in. And also very important is how do we ensure that those historically underrepresented communities can receive these economic benefits and economic new opportunities that spring by the carbon management industry. So next we have a speaker, and Rogan, who is the CEO of Edge Collaborative. She will share her thoughts on building together advancing community benefits in California.
And good morning to everyone. Happy to be here. I think we had the slides up. Yes, no? All right, I will assume they are up. I'm going to start off a little bit today talking a little bit about some of the things, thank you for the slides, some of the themes we've heard this morning from a variety of the different speakers. And then I'll transition into a little bit about who I am, where I come from, and why I'm here talking to you today about community benefits. So we've heard today some phrases, I've been taking notes around social vulnerability, equity and environmental justice, a social license to operate, buy-in from the community, community benefits, economic benefit. I think writ large, what we're saying in different ways is who are we serving, and who are the communities that are going to be impacted by these decisions that we're making about projects in the context of a transitioning economy. So with that in mind, slides, there we go. We're going to talk a little bit today about the context of community, what this actually means in the context of community benefits, and writ large kind of how are we actually seeing this play out in a transitioning economy, some notes from the field, and then a question that I will pose to the group today about under what conditions. I give you this context today as the founder and CEO of Edge Collaborative, a civic incubator based in Stockton in the northern part of the Central Valley. And I came at this work about 4 years ago, having worked first in local government and seeing firsthand, working in local government, how often disconnected community priorities have and were and are being from decisions that governments, local, county, state, and federal are making about economic development. I come to you also as a proponent of economic development and of technology in general, and I have gotten an education over the past 4 or 5 years living in the Central Valley, understanding that for many communities that we work and serve, economic development that I have taken for granted as a progressive good thing is often not seen as a progressive good thing. And I've sort of been on a journey myself trying to understand why that is. So before we start, I'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say community. I think we mean different things when we use this term, and it's important to understand what this actually means in context. We define little c community as the broader community, so residents, businesses, nonprofits, public agencies that are operating in a particular region. So everyone here today, community, right? Capital C community is actually different. Capital C community we define as the groups and individuals that will be most impacted by a certain decision or a project, but who have historically had the least power, the least input, the least ability to voice or influence the outcomes of a particular project or decision that's going to impact them. So when I'm talking today about community, I'm talking about big C or capital C community. That's important context. The additional context here is that when we think about community, we think about the reality of communities and why it can be so challenging to work with, is because if you look at a map of California and you're talking about carbon, you're talking about carbon management, carbon removal, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, whatever flavor it is that you're working on, the things that community sees and feels viscerally is air quality, water quality, soil quality, and the impacts to the food and supply chain and their everyday lives, right? And so I think this is important to understand, that we can talk about community benefits all day long, but if we're not actually dealing with the visceral reality of air quality issues and the reality of uncapped oil wells in our communities, that is going to be one of the first things that folks are going to raise a question about and say, I need this problem solved. I need to not have disproportionately high rates of asthma in my community. I need to not have to deal with disproportionately bad outcomes around public health. And so for this, I think it's an important ground setting and baseline activity, sort of understanding to really get at the psychology of why this can be so challenging to build in the context of carbon management. I'll then kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about some frameworks for thinking about engaging with community, knowing that community engagement does not actually equal community benefits. They're actually very different activities. One is a precursor or a prerequisite to the other. And this is a framework to think about how community engagement often happens in a place. The left side really talks about and thinks about fractured dynamics. This is sort of, there's a project, there's a community, the two often never shall meet, and if they do, it's contentious, it's troubling, and folks normally never walk out agreeing on anything. That is, I would argue, the status quo in a lot of these communities that we're working in and serving. On the right-hand side, you start to think about how do you actually have more advanced types of engagement? How do you actually think about engaging on a more regular basis? And the default starting point, I think, for a lot of us is project-specific. I have a concept I want to turn into a business. I have a project I want to sort of go after some sort of tax credit or investment that the state or the federal government is putting in front of us. How do we actually get that project to be economically viable and off the ground and permitted? It's perfectly reasonable to have a conversation with community that is project-specific, but we can go further. We can go further and start to engage community and say, what do you actually care about? What's the context in which you're operating? What has the region historically struggled with doing or accomplishing? Or what is it trying to achieve? And this is a different way of thinking about community engagement, because now you're not saying, hey, I want to build a project. You're saying, hey, I have a vested interest, economic interest in making this project work, but I want to understand what you're trying to do and what you care about. If that conversation happens, then you can get to the point where it's about building coalition. And it's about building coalition in the context of safety and public health, in the context of what Luis was mentioning around community governance, and finally this piece around economic considerations. What does it actually mean to think about jobs? What does it actually mean to think about revenue share? What does it actually think about how do we actually invest back into the community in a way that makes sense for what they care about on their pocketbook? And the thing I'll just mention here briefly is we talk a lot in my organization about civic infrastructure. And civic infrastructure, we know, is wildly different across the state. But civic infrastructure is the ability for us to actually think about and shape how we talk to people that we don't always agree with, right? And so the work that we do is not predicated on agreeing 100% of the time. It's predicated on an understanding of what are you trying to do, what am I trying to do, and is there a middle in which we can meet and trying to address both sides of the disagreement. And using that as a baseline, these are some examples of considerations. These are not community benefits necessarily, but these are considerations for how we think about surfacing the considerations that community might have. So if you're looking at safety and public health considerations, air, water, soil quality, and longstanding pollution, this has been mentioned a number of different times. And yes, it is prioritizing the plugging and capping of abandoned oil and gas wells. It's also thinking about setbacks for carbon pipelines, for homes and businesses. It's thinking about the open research questions, and there are many, around carbon management and carbon removal and carbon capture. And it's thinking about long-term safety and long-term maintenance of infrastructure that's being financed. What does this look like in 50 years, in 75 years, in 100 years? These are the questions that communities have very justifiably been asking about and will continue to ask about before they feel comfortable, if they will ever feel comfortable, moving forward and building coalition around this type of infrastructure. The second piece sort of gets to the next level, which is, I would argue, some of the most interesting work around community governance. The simple idea here is, how do you actually put community in the driver's seat to shape outcomes and to design the ways in which a project should or should not happen? So this thinks a little bit about also directing investments into local and regional priorities. It also critically thinks about the role of input, community input and ownership around data accessibility. Who's actually monitoring this infrastructure? Who's actually going to be doing the monitoring? Is the data accessible? Is the data transparent? And what are the standards by which we're measuring these projects across the board? But it's really about putting community in the driver's seat, which for us is not, I would argue as a state, not the standard. We have not been used to operating this way ever in our economic development worlds. So this is a huge paradigm shift for us to think about putting community and giving them any degree of oversight or any degree of ownership or input into shaping a project at this level. But the federal government is moving in a direction that is trying to center equity. It's trying to center racial equity, and these are ways that we can actually start to operationalize and think differently on our projects to actually move in that direction along with the government. The final piece here is around the economic considerations. And this is around, this has been mentioned a number of different times, what's the cost of living? What are the cost of living concerns that folks have? Is housing affordable? Is energy access, are utility rates going to increase if projects are built? How do we actually maintain or actually get to affordability for these things that are going to impact workers and workers' desires to live here, work here, move here? But it's also thinking about, what does access to transportation look like? Do folks and workers live in transportation deserts? Do they have access to public transportation? Do they have access to zero-emission transportation? And finally, I think sort of the vanguard of this is something mentioned on the last panel too, is how do we actually think about revenue share, profit share with communities that could be part of this project? And I'll talk a little bit about an example of that in a little while. But I share this framework and these considerations as fodder in the context of a transitioning economy that is actively grappling with what it means to actually center community in a lot of these conversations where community has never been not just centered, but considered meaningfully. So let's make this tangible. On the left is where a lot of us are today, not just in Kern County, but up and down the state. And this is where we're at. The question is, how do we get from the left to the right? And I'll read some of these quotes just to make this a little bit more real for folks. Imagine being an organization saying, we want you to partner with us on a community benefits plan, but there's no need for you to understand our technology. We're going to have one side of the sandbox over here, we're going to have another side of the sandbox over here, and they don't have to meet. There's no need to sort of cross-pollinate those ideas. You might have an industry group or a partner saying, community wants unrealistic things that we've never done before. We're not comfortable doing that. You might have someone say, we're focused on proving a new business model. We don't really care, we don't really need to focus on remediating environmental justice issues. You might also say, there's little need to coordinate with other companies in the industry. We're competitors, we have our own proprietary information, we have intellectual property considerations and concerns. That's where we've been, that's where we've come from. The question is, what do we do after that? What do we do to move the ball a little bit further down the field? And how do we work differently? So these are some ways to think about working differently. How do we ensure that community benefits plans are holistic representations of what we're seeking to build? And yes, embedding the technology considerations into the benefit plan so that there's a holistic representation overall. What's a way to turn our deficits into our strategic advantage? So if our community wants cleaner air, they want setbacks from pipelines, they want capped oil wells, how will those efforts and investing in those efforts help us be more competitive for Department of Energy funding that is trying to prioritize disadvantaged communities? That's a different way of thinking about those challenges. How are we embedding federal guidance around Justice 40 into our project? How can community help to shape outcomes and identify industry and government blind spots? There's been a number of blind spots discussed today. I don't have to remind folks of that. And then finally, how do we collectively prepare our region to draw down significant public investment to bolster more inclusive types of economic development? We know that this public investment moment is not going to last forever. We know that there is untold amounts of money at historically the state level, increasingly the federal level, and that money has to find projects. But it's going to find projects that are actually aligned with community. This is a mission imperative. It's not a nice to have. And so this becomes an existential question for a region and the future of a region's growth and economic development goals. So this is really about reframing community not as a nice to have, not as an afterthought. How do you fundamentally embed it into the strategic competitive advantage of what is trying to be built? A few quotes, we think about frontline communities. This is a quote from the president of the Voice of the Arctic, Inupiat, that talks about, this is from congressional testimony given last year, it talks about the fact that on the North Slope of Alaska, this particular community group does not actually see a trade-off, or they believe that both resource development and conservation can be done. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. There is actually a way to do both responsibly. And in California, last year, a number of environmental justice groups put forward a series of policy recommendations that you can find online, and they're talking about how do we weigh and risk the benefits of technologies and implement a precautionary approach that prevents new harms, uses inherently safer systems, and does not add to the cumulative pollution load. So my point in sharing these two quotes is that it presents two very different perspectives on how to actually engage with community in a meaningful way, and recognizing that yes, there is nuance. There are real concerns that environmental and social justice groups have, and yet there is a different way of thinking about and building coalition around these concerns. You might be asking yourself, give me some examples. So around safety and public health, around community governance, around economic considerations, there are different ways of thinking about and doing this work. And I will point to two here in detail. One around the economic considerations, the Alaska Permanent Fund, which I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with. The oil and gas industry has actually developed a revenue share model that deposits dividends from that industry into households, into household level payments as a way to sort of align the benefits that that industry is reaping with the lived experience of households in the state. And the community governance considerations, a project in Yuba City that brought community in early on in that project development stage to ensure that its concerns, in this case around water availability and access, were embedded into the actual engineering and design of the carbon project that's listed here. So these are different ways to think about embedding safety and public health and community governance and economic considerations as early on in the process as possible. I will end on this note, which is to say that this is not theoretical. I work in Stockton, I work in northern San Joaquin Valley, and have been working more intensively in this space for the last 3 years. I was brought into the carbon space not because I was excited about or even an expert about carbon management or removal. I was brought in because an industry group, a very well-meaning industry group, approached us and said, we'd like to talk to you about community engagement. And that led us on a whole journey to realize that most of the environmental justice groups in the region had no idea what the technology was. And were being asked to sign off on a technology that frankly, scared them. And that took us down a path of reaching out to the Lawrence Livermore National Lab and asking them to do education and baseline setting without industry in the room, to have a conversation about what is the science, what is the engineering, and what is the technology. Importantly, in that conversation, we did not talk about the implications. We did not talk about the consequences. We purely talked about the science and technology. And we did that to ensure that it was as depoliticized a conversation as possible. We did not want to have a food fight at that early stage of the conversation. But what it did over the course of the next 2 years is it enabled a degree of trust that has continued and has led to bringing the US Department of Energy to Stockton to ensure that the research questions that environmental justice groups had could actually be answered by looking and modeling the likelihood of a carbon leakage scenario in the Delta. So I share this knowing that the process is long, the process is messy. It has taken us 3+ years to get to this point, and we are nowhere close to where we need to be. But it has opened a dialogue with people and among stakeholders that normally don't like each other. They don't like talking to each other. They don't want to talk about negative emissions, but they are recognizing that there is a way and a path forward to find disagreement and to actually work through the issues and the risks. There are risks to a path that is safer and hopefully has some degree of economic benefit in the community where it should be cited. So my final question for the group, happy to get into questions. The questions that we ask ourselves are, under what conditions should these efforts be responsibly undertaken if it's going to happen at all? If it's going to happen, what are the conditions under which we should do this if we want to be responsible, and what do we need to do differently to get there? Thank you. Any questions or disagreements? All right. Thank you.